Good morning, students, and welcome to Sandhan. Today's topic is Dr. Johnson as a critic. English poet, essayist, critic, journalist, lexicographer, conversationalist, regarded as one of the outstanding figures of the 18th century life and letters. Johnson's literary reputation is part dependent on James Boswell's biography, The Life of Samuel Johnson, with whom he formed one of the most famous friendships in literary history. I have with me today Dr. Indira Nityanandam, who will be guiding us on Johnson as a critic. Welcome to Sandhan, ma'am.
Thank you.
Dr. Nityanandam has done her doctoral thesis on Indian women's writing in English. Her field of special interest is translation studies, Indian writing in English, diaspora, and ELT. At present, she is serving as the principal of Srimati S.R. Mehta Arts College. She is also the chairperson of the Board of Studies for English, Gujarat University. Without wasting any time, ma'am, may I request you to start, please?
Thank you, Namita. Good morning, my dear students. Samuel Johnson. Dr. Samuel Johnson, not to be confused with Ben Jonson. Remember, my dear students, right from the spelling, there's a great world of difference between the two. When we talk of Dr. Samuel Johnson, remember, we are in the 18th century. When we talk of Ben Jonson, we go back to the age of Shakespeare. We are in the Elizabethan age. Ben Jonson has J-O-N-S-O-N, whereas Dr. Samuel Johnson has J-O-H-N-S-O-N. What do we remember him as? Of course, we are going to talk about him as a critic. But you cannot talk about a person like Dr. Johnson only as a critic. When we think of him, as Namita just mentioned, there are many roles that he performed. There are many achievements that he has to his credit. And therefore, next slide please. If you look at all that he has been doing, he is certainly a multifaceted personality. He's a poet. One of his most famous poems is London. And again, because it's a common name, do not confuse it with the better-known poem, London, by William Blake. He's a critic, and we're going to talk about it at great length. He was an essayist, contributing to the periodicals of his time, the Rambler, the Idler in particular. He was a biographer, and he was a lexicographer. Maybe for some of you, the word lexicographer is something new. Maybe the word lexicography does not really figure in your everyday knowledge of the English language. The common word that we use is dictionary. Today we call it dictionary. It used to be called a lexicograph, and somebody who writes a dictionary. Right? You don't have a writer, you don't have an author of a dictionary, but somebody who compiles the words together, puts them together, used to be called a lexicographer. And when we think of Dr. Johnson, this was one of his most important contributions, not only to his age, but to the English language also. Remember, whenever we look at a writer, we cannot look at him in isolation. Most of you students are in the third year, and therefore you already have behind you 2 years of English literature studies. You are aware of many of the ages. You are aware of many of the writers. So let us quickly try and see who were the contemporaries of Dr. Samuel Johnson. You have Addison and Steele. Do you remember The Spectator? Do you remember how much they contributed to the growth of the English essay? Particularly what we refer to as the periodical essay. Do you remember, some of you at least, Sir Roger de Coverley? Do you remember the Coverley Papers? How both these writers attempted to bring philosophy out of the closets into the marketplace and the coffee houses. The next writer that I think you should know in this age is Alexander Pope. The Rape of the Lock, I'm sure, comes to mind. The Mock Heroic, I'm sure you remember Belinda, who was based on Arabella Fermor. I'm sure you know the lock here does not refer to the key and the lock, but it refers to a lock of hair. Who were the other major writers of this period? Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, Sterne. I'm putting them together because all of them were novelists. And remember, in your history of literature, you have certainly studied that the novel as a literary form really began in this age. You might go back to Boccaccio and think of him as one of the first writers of tales, of stories in Europe. But when we think of English literature in particular, it is the 18th century which really saw the growth and development of the novel as a literary form. Richardson and Fielding are two important names, but we must have Smollett and Sterne also. The next writer is Goldsmith. Remember Oliver Goldsmith? He was a poet, he was a dramatist, he was a critic, he was an essayist, he was a novelist. You have all these that he has contributed. And then Jonathan Swift. Remember Gulliver's Travels? Remember the wonderful Lilliputians? Remember the giants in the land of Brobdingnag? And that brings me to Dr. Johnson. What is the age in which Dr. Johnson lived? What is the age that you call it? Do you call it the neoclassical age? Do you call it the age of Queen Anne? Do you call it the Augustan age? All these names are equally correct. And different writers, different critics prefer to call this age by different names. Neoclassical, because it was attempting, neoclassical, because it was attempting to rival the classical age of ancient Rome. The age of Queen Anne, because she was ruling. Remember, we talk of the Elizabethan age, we talk of the Victorian age, and here we talk of the age of Queen Anne. We talk of the Augustan age because, remember, Augustus Caesar was an important ruler of ancient Rome. What are the characteristics of this age? Johnson himself believed, many critics believe, and I think most of you would agree, that the age in which the writer lives influences his thinking and his writing in great measure. So when we look at the characteristics of this age, the 18th century, the neoclassical age, one important discovery, invention, that contributed to an increase in the reading public is the printing press. Remember the Industrial Revolution, remember the printing press, remember these periodicals that started coming out. I'm sure you know that earlier, when you wrote something, you had to make copies of it. No Xeroxes in those days, my dear students. You had to sit and copy and then give it to others. But once the printing press was there, you could make hundreds of thousands of copies at the same time. Another characteristic of this period, which I've already mentioned, is the growth of the novel, the growth of the periodicals, the essay as a literary form. I'm sure you know the word genre. A little difficult to pronounce. Get the spelling right, and I'm sure you'll have your pronunciation right. The essay as a literary form or a literary genre. Remember, not the personal essay, which Charles Lamb was later going to make very popular, but the periodical essay as a literary genre was another important facet, aspect of this age. What are coffee houses? Today, I'm sure many of you love to sit and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee for many hours together. And there are many such coffee houses in most parts of our country today. But what were these coffee houses? Yes, similar to the ones we have today, but different to some extent. Because you had these groups of intellectuals, maybe artists, maybe writers, they met there regularly and they sat together and they talked about important things. When I say important, it could be literature, it could be society, it could be politics, it could be books. There was a lot of discussion, and Dr. Johnson himself was a frequent visitor to some coffee houses. It's interesting when we see that there was a table at which all these people sat. And I believe in those days, on the other tables, there were people sitting, pretending to drink their coffee, but actually wanting to listen to what these people were saying. Isn't it interesting? We wouldn't call it eavesdropping. We wouldn't call it bad manners, but we would say this was a wonderful way of seeing what great people talked about. And you had writers, you had painters like Joshua Reynolds sitting together and discussing many important things. Next slide, please. That now brings me to Dr. Johnson. Let us quickly try and see what are his major works. We are to talk about Johnson as a critic, but I would like to tell you that Dr. Johnson did not write any great critical treatises. When you think of Coleridge, you think of Biographia Literaria, but when you think of Dr. Johnson, you don't have any one work like that. Then, how is it that we come to our conclusions about Dr. Johnson as a critic? You know, you have to select, you have to cull, you have to read between the lines in order to understand what he actually wrote. As a writer, Dr. Johnson showed wit, sharpness of mind, fascinating Latinisms, and short Anglo-Saxon words. Many of his works, let me tell you, my dear students, went into major reprints even during his own time. Before I come to Preface to Shakespeare, let me talk about a couple of his works which are not so well known. His first work was translation of Jerome Lobo's Voyage to Abyssinia in 1735. And then he had Irene, which is an unfinished tragedy. That brings me to Preface to Shakespeare, about which we will be talking at length later. We will talk about lives of poets, the number of lives that he wrote. It actually began as a series of introduction to a collection of English poets. Then you have Rasselas, his only novel. More than 200 editions in many languages. The story is like an adventure story. Not very popular. Most of us don't read it. But it is the story of an Abyssinian prince who escapes from his palace along with his sister to see the outside world. Johnson was known for his witticism. Johnson was known for his precise definitions. I'd just like to give you a line from Rasselas where he says, "Marriage has many pains, celibacy has no pleasures." Let me repeat that. Marriage has many pains, celibacy has no pleasures. Then you have his poem, London, which is a modernization of the Roman poet Juvenal's third satire. You have another poem, Vanity of Human Wishes, which was a great success even during his own time. Time permitting, maybe I shall read you some passages from both these poems. Then we come to the Dictionary of the English Language. He started planning this sometime in 1746, but the first edition appeared only in 1755. So for 9 long years, this is what Dr. Johnson was doing, collating words. Because as I told you, you can't write a dictionary. What you really need to do is to compile a dictionary. And what can we say about Johnson's achievement as a lexicographer? That he has superb, precise definitions, that he has immense quotations. That's what makes his first dictionary, a dictionary of the English language, very, very interesting, informative, even today. Another major contribution of Dr. Johnson is his essays to the periodicals Rambler and the Idler. In fact, Dr. Johnson started by contributing to the Gentleman's Magazine, where actually he was himself the editor for a few years. In fact, it was his first job. Other writings of Dr. Johnson that we should just remember when we're thinking of the contribution of Dr. Johnson is the short lives that he wrote of his contemporaries, as well as the parliamentary debates. I believe in those days you could not enter Parliament and jot down anything. So people had to come out after the session of Parliament, the British Parliament. They would come out and they would talk about what happened, what were the arguments, what the debates that took place. And then Dr. Johnson, on the basis of those little notes that he got, I believe he would write the entire debate. This gives us some idea of his ability as a writer, as well as his ability to create, as well as his ability to think. These, my dear students, are the major writings of Dr. Johnson. When we call him a multifaceted personality, we must remember that he was a poet, novelist, dramatist, essayist, critic, and a lexicographer, in addition to being a biographer. Let us now move on to talking about Dr. Johnson as a critic. What is criticism? Most of you know about it. What are the major kinds of criticism? I'm sure you know that too. When did criticism begin? Probably criticism began when the first literary work was written. This criticism might have been formal, it might have been informal, it might have been oral, it might have been written. But whenever there is a work of art, and remember, we use the word criticism in a very general sense too, and therefore you could have criticism, art criticism, when somebody has an exhibition of his paintings. You could have film criticism when a new movie is released. You could have modern books, you could have bestsellers, you could have critics writing about that. But of course, we as students of literature are interested in literary criticism. Let us see what are the chief characteristics of Dr. Johnson as a critic. When we think of criticism, we wonder whether criticism can be true for all times, or whether criticism changes with every age. Is the criticism of Plato and Aristotle, or Longinus and Horace, the same as that of Sidney and Ben Jonson? Is the criticism of Addison the same as that of Dr. Johnson? And what happens when we move to the Romantic age, later still into the Victorian age?